behalf of Pulsar team and Focal Network, we are happy to welcome you to our 16th Pulsar webinar entitled Pathways to Accrual, Insight and Lesson Learned. The key objectives of the event are overview IFAC activities in support of the adoption and implementation of IPSAS, present the structured key findings of the tool, discuss insight and lesson learned from implementation of public sector accounting reforms, and share Armenia and Brazil experiences in terms of transitioning from cash to accrual accounting and IPSAS implementation. In order to achieve the proposed objectives, we have a tight agenda and a group of renowned experts who were directly or indirectly involved in the development of this tool. I would like to remind you that all presentations, including the translations, will be briefly available on our Pulsar website. Please also feel free to post any questions you might have using your preferred language directly in the chat. Without further ado, I pass the floor to Daniel Boyce, Practice Manager for the Governance team for East Europe and Central Asia, to share with us some opening remarks. Dan?
Thank you, Dimitri. Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are connecting from today. On behalf of the World Bank, the Pulsar FinCup and EduCup, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this joint Pulsar and Focal webinar, which we also call the Smart Interactive Talks. This is the 7th time that we're getting together in an event jointly organized, jointly organized by Pulsar and Focal. So we're glad that we've been able to continue this cross collaboration, which has been very productive. Today, we're especially bringing in IFAC and some country presenters to present the Pathways to Accrual tool, which was recently completed by the IPSAS Board. We'll have the opportunity to hear more about IFAC's role in the implementation of public sector accounting reforms, key features and insights of this new tool, lessons from learned from implementation of PSA reforms, and then the specific Armenia and Brazil experiences in terms of implementation of PSA reforms in their countries. As you know, most, if not all, of the Pulsar countries are progressing towards implementation of PSA reforms and in most cases towards accrual accounting. This includes the transition that they may be undertaking to accruals and in IPSAS implementation. And sometimes it's more direct and sometimes more indirect. So the Pathways to Accrual tool gives us a good resource for depending on, for different countries at different stages to support your ongoing reforms in our countries and really around the globe. The tool is intended to assist the public sector entities, which could include the national and subnational governments, state-owned enterprises, or even international governmental organizations that wish to report on the basis of accrual and possibly also to adopt IPSAS. It can also be useful for entities that maybe are already more or less on the accrual basis of accounting, but you want to move fuller into the adoption of IPSAS. And then the tool can also help specific public sector professionals working in the accounting and finance areas to face accounting and PFM type challenges that you might be trying to work out within the context of your own organization. And then to accomplish those goals, the tool includes a wide range of resources. One is just an overview of the context in which the transition to the accrual accounting may be occurring. Another is a discussion of different pathways that entities who are looking for some type of incremental implementation may adopt. So different ways that you might decide to proceed to implement accrual accounting in your country or organization. And then also to identify the main tasks associated with along this pathway, you could say. Things like recognition of assets, liabilities, revenues, classification of expenses, and then issues and challenges associated with identifying and measuring all these elements in your financial statements. The tool also looks to help in terms of implications of adopting accrual basis. IPSAS provide some practical suggestions based on the experiences of other entities and jurisdictions. Now that IPSAS have been around for quite a while, we have experiences there, and IFAC is sharing those. And then links to some other useful resources for implementation of PSA reforms, guidance, resources, and connections, including with our own Pulsar website, where we try as much as possible to share between us. And with today being a good example, I think, with Pulsar sharing what's happening in IFAC, and IFAC sharing some of the information that Pulsar comes out, and some of the tools that we've come up with. So with that, I just want to say that I appreciate all the speakers, the guests, and the participants, for you, all of you, for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the event. We're looking forward to also seeing you in the next Pulsar webinars. This is the second one this week, so we won't keep up that pace, but we'll continue to have the webinars as we go along, and also continue to look for opportunities to have face-to-face meetings and conferences when that is more possible to do. So back to you, Dimitri, for the further proceedings.
Thank you, Dan. Now I would like to invite Juan Torres Garcia, who is going to provide some brief opening remarks on behalf of the Focal network. Juan, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation that has been made to us by the WorldBank through Pulsar, by the country forum members, which we are happy to accept them. And thanks very much also to add a Focal to these initiatives. I also want to thank the representatives and officials of Focal that are together with us today. Thanks very much for connecting this early in the morning. And also from Focal, there is a commitment to keep and uphold and strengthen these sharing efforts, and with forum members, and obviously with Focal, and likewise efforts. Thanks for inviting us, and for we have tried to work closely and work on a joint agenda, or to keep up with the necessary activities that are required to introduce this knowledge sharing practices and the changing in paradigms that has been brought about by the pandemic, so that we expect that will be left behind gradually, and to use and to resort to more constant interaction. The invitation came from the need and the to share a Latin American experience, a country experience in adopting the IPSAS public sector in the transition to accrual-based accounting. We thank the Brazilian representing us today, representing Focal today in this event. We agree that the accrual basis is an important transition, is an important road to be traveled, and this requires reflecting. And these meetings provide a greater context, not just based on the experience of the leading countries, but also to adopt better practices as we move that road. Thank you very much, and let's have a great session today. Thanks very much.
Now I would like to invite Laura Leka to share her vision of IFAC's role in implementation of public sector accounting reforms around the world.
Thank you, Dimitri, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Lecker and I lead on IFAC's public sector initiatives, and it's a pleasure to be participating in today's webinar. And I just wanted to thank the team at Pulsar and Focal for hosting this event to showcase pathways to accrual. A little bit about IFAC. IFAC is the International Federation of Accountants, and IFAC is the global organization for the accountancy profession with 180 members and associate organizations across 135 countries, and more than 3 million accountants worldwide. As it was said in the introduction for this part of the session, I will be sharing a brief overview of IFAC's role at an international level to support public sector accounting reform, and in particular, the adoption and implementation of accrual accounting. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I wanted to start with IFAC's policy and advocacy role. So IFAC, as the voice of the global accountancy profession, speaks out on key policy issues impacting the profession and society. And one of the ways that we do this is to develop points of view, which represent IFAC's official position on areas of high priority. And that's what you see on the right of the screen here. So strengthening public financial management, or PFM, is one of these priority areas. So last year we released this point of view on greater transparency and accountability in the public sector. And this just outlines how IFAC believes the public sector can achieve the strong financial management necessary to build a prosperous future for us all, and importantly specifies the role that the accountancy profession plays. The point of view is split into 3 parts. The first part is on strong governance and public financial management, and this is fundamental to ensure governments and public sector entities around the world make informed decisions for people, the planet, and the economy. And a key element of this is high quality global public sector accounting standards, and in particular, the accrual basis IPSAS. And then the second part is on the key role of the accountancy profession in the public sector, and this includes professional accountancy organizations, as well as the individual accountants working within public sector entities. And then the third part is on preparing for 2030, so underscoring that both financial and non-financial information are needed to make the difficult decisions necessary to balance the many competing priorities with delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is all while ensuring long-term financial resilience and ongoing public service delivery. This point of view, sorry, if you could go back one, thank you. This point of view sets out our baseline messaging, which we'll continue to use and build on in our other advocacy efforts. And the box on the left here just shows an example of this. So every year IFAC issues a G20 call to action, and the most recent is summarized on the slide here. So there are 4 priorities, 2 actions, and 1 ultimate goal. So I've highlighted in green here, but the public sector transparency and integrity is one of the 4 priorities, and championing public financial management is one of 2 key strategic actions. And then in addition to this, as part of IFAC's B20 engagement, IFAC efforts have put the need to improve the efficiency of public administrations as one of the policy recommendations of the global business community to the G20. And this recommendation includes specific mention of accrual accounting and the adoption of international public sector accounting standards. So what I'm really trying to emphasize with this slide here is just how important the topic of today's webinar is to IFAC and to the global accountancy profession. If we could go to the next slide. So now just looking at the global picture as shown by the International Public Sector Accountability Index, and we're seeing that more public sector entities are moving to accrual. And for background on the index, it was first compiled by CFRR and IFAC in 2018, really to understand the global picture in terms of public sector financial reporting. And then to monitor progress, it was recently updated with 2020 actual data, 2025 forecasts, and 2030 projections. And then compiling this data involved a rigorous process to ensure that the data was collected on a consistent basis and that it was backed up with supporting evidence. And the index covers 165 jurisdictions. And the headline that you can see from the graph here is that 30% of those 165 jurisdictions reported on accrual in their 2020 financial statements, which is an increase of 6% compared to the 2018 data. And there's a positive rising trend. So you can see in 2025, the forecast is an increase to 50%. And then looking at 2030, the current projection is 73%, although that is inevitably subject to more uncertainty, I think, particularly in the current volatile and uncertain environment where reform programs may be impacted by the pandemic and other crises. But I think still safe to say that there is a significant shift from cash to accrual reporting by governments. And then alongside this move to accrual, the index also looks at financial reporting frameworks and the extent to which IPSAS are used either directly or indirectly with modifications for local context or as a reference to develop national standards. And the trend here is positive as well. So in 2020, of those reporting on accrual, 57% are using IPSAS. In 2025, that increases to 73%. And then by 2030, the current projection is 81%. And this is really important because as well as needing accrual reporting across jurisdictions, it's also important to have that comparability as well. And I think what these results really demonstrate is an increased demand on the IPSAS-B and its work, but also it shows that there is a great need for both advocacy and support and implementation. So that brings me to my next slide, please. Promoting IPSAS adoption and implementation. And this is a theme in IPSAS-B's strategy and work plan. And IPSAS-B has a very active approach to this, to outreach, and events like today are a great example. And that enables it to engage in a global dialogue with constituents. But it's important to recognize that to be successful, a move to accrual is usually part of a much larger reform program, and that requires changes across a range of areas, including professional skills and capacity, systems and internal controls, and processes for reporting transactions. So this involves a number of different groups with different skills and expertise at various stages throughout the transition process. And what the table on the slide here demonstrates is that it just shows the primary and potential roles across the various types of organizations, so particularly at a national level to support adoption and implementation. And then for IFAC's part and our role at the international level, contributing to and promoting the development, adoption and implementation of high quality international standards is one of our key strategic objectives, and this includes supporting IPSAS-B and its work. And in my opening slide, I gave some examples of how we're promoting adoption of IPSAS, but IFAC has also been working with IPSAS-B to play a greater role in supporting implementation. So on the next slide, I'd just like to highlight some of the recent projects. So the four main projects are listed here, and I've already mentioned the index, so I'll just briefly cover the other three. So first off is the COVID-19 Intervention Assessment Tool, and IFAC developed this tool with the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in partnership with IPSAS-B, and it just really provides an immediate way of evaluating the economic impacts of current and planned policy initiatives and interventions, and including, very importantly, the impact on the balance sheet. And this tool can be used independently of any given jurisdiction's public sector accounting basis. We also have on the slide here, Train the Trainer, and I'm actually going to come back to that one in my next slide. And then lastly, the focus of today's event, which Pathways to Accrual. And IFAC worked with CFRR and IPSAS-B to produce this practical guidance, and it's been incorporated into an online platform. And as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the very important features of this platform is that it does allow other resources to be added and linked. And we've already added a number of useful Pulsar publications to the platform. I won't go into the detail of this because I know Ian, Ross, and David will talk through the content of Pathways to Accrual in the next session. And then moving on to, sorry, if you could go back one slide, please. Thank you. Moving on to Train the Trainer. So IFAC does not provide certifications or training ourselves, but the intention with these materials is to make them available for free for non-commercial use so that IFAC members and other stakeholders and partners can use them for training in their own jurisdictions and then update them where necessary to incorporate country-specific requirements or considerations. And the material is intended to assist governments and government organizations currently on a cash basis or a near cash or modified cash basis of accounting in the process of transitioning to accrual. And there are 10 modules with an emphasis on areas considered to be the most significant to public sector entities transitioning to IPSAS for the first time. So the modules cover an introduction, assets, liabilities, revenues, expenses, financial instruments, consolidation and public sector combinations, presentation, first-time adoption, and other pronouncements. And then each module has a training manual and a set of accompanying slide decks. And these slide decks have notes for the trainer. And then each module is broken down into a series of topics that are, as far as possible, standalone, so that they can be delivered as individual sessions. And so presenters can pick and choose which topics to focus on and in what order to run sessions. And they have been developed with students in mind. So they have practical examples, they have review questions to test understanding, and they can be used for either in-person or virtual training sessions. And we launched the materials in November 2020, and we've had some very positive feedback from those who have used them to deliver training. But we are also aware that there is a demand for translations of the materials, and they are currently being translated into Japanese and into Arabic, but I know there's also a high demand for translation into French and Spanish, and we are actively working to get these translated. And then to my final slide. Thank you. I thought I would just finish up and highlight some of our ongoing priorities. And as I said at the start, the topic of today's webinar is a key priority for IFAC, and we are committed to continuing to support the adoption and implementation of IPSAS. We will continue to engage closely with IPSAS B and also our member bodies to identify further demand-driven initiatives and ways we can support. And our efforts are also focused on increasing use of the existing tools that I mentioned earlier. Regional events like today are so important in raising awareness of the guidance materials available and also understanding the practical challenges. And on the slide here is just an example of an upcoming event we have next month in the Middle East and North Africa region. And then, as I mentioned earlier, translations are a key priority to help with the use of the materials globally. And then finally, the launch of Pathways was just the beginning. We now want to ensure that as more jurisdictions move to accrual, that we capture the learnings and share these globally. I think because for those that are either considering or in the process of moving to accrual, there is a lot that can be learned from the experience of others. So with that, I will finish up and let Ian and Ross talk you through the content of Pathways to Accrual. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was really very illustrative, and I wonder whether the part of the trainers we could also present, disseminate as part of the EduCop activities if they have not done that as yet. Our next speakers are Ian Karatzer and Ross Smith, who are going to share with us key features and sides of the tool.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to colleagues from Pulsar for the opportunity to present the Pathways to Accrual tool. And in terms of the presentation today, unfortunately, our colleague David Watkins couldn't be present as advertised on the programme, but I'm joined by my colleague from IPSAS B, Ross Smith, who is the programme and technical director for the board. And essentially I'm here really in two capacities, because the Pathways to Accrual is a development of the existing IPSAS B Study 14, which was a paper-based document. Pathways, as we'll show you, is very much a web-based tool with the capacity, as Laura said, to be updated to include experience as that is increasingly gained from around the world. So that was a very crucial step included in the last IPSAS strategy. But I'm also here because, along with David, I played a key role with my CFRR role, which I still do some work for CFRR. In terms of sharing our experience in a number of jurisdictions around the world, but very particularly because we have participated in the transition of the UK public sector to accrual reporting, particularly implementing whole of government accounts, the consolidation of the UK public sector. So very much what this does is it shares our experiences of things that went right, but also things that we wish we'd done and we'd known up front. And we were supported in that by a group of experts from around the world. So it very much is a synthesis of everybody's practical experience, really to help as many people across as many jurisdictions as possible around the world to make the transition to accrual successfully. And I really would emphasize that point that Laura made, that going back to what she showed in terms of the International Public Sector Financial Accountability Index, increasingly governments around the world are transitioning to accrual. I know from personal experience, there's nothing like actually talking to other practitioners, sharing experience, ideas with them to really make your own implementation much more successful and to address the problems that you will undoubtedly come across as you move through the accrual implementation process. And up front, I should say, the reason why it's called pathways is because we recognize that all jurisdictions differ in where they're coming from, in the systems that they have, in the development of the government finance profession, in the readiness of officials to support accrual reforms, and the economic and social context. So all of those vary, and those will impact on what the appropriate approach to accrual implementation is in your jurisdiction. And it really, and this is consistent with what Laura was saying, really the success of an accrual implementation depends on it being integrated with other reforms, with other public financial management and governance reforms. It's no good having a great set of financial statements produced at the end of the year if those don't actually influence what happens during the year, the accountability of politicians and officials within government for how money is spent. And so it really is crucial that the reforms are set in the broader context. So Ross, if you can pass on to the next slide. And very deliberately, the tool itself covers a series of areas. You've got the topic headings down the side of the slide, and it very deliberately starts off at the top in the broad context and then works through governance to within governance, PFM frameworks, and then thinks about how would you approach implementation and what are the key things that you need to do in order to implement successfully, right down to things that you're going to need to think about at an individual entity level. So it starts broad, and then it gradually becomes more granular as you work your way through each of the different levels. And at all of those levels, apart from at the top level, there are examples, there are tools. Certainly, as you'll see from some of the shots, you'll recognize some of the tools that have been produced and the publications that have been produced through the Pulsar program. And I think all of the materials I've seen coming out of the Pulsar program, I think are excellent. But equally, there are plenty of tools from around the world, for example, in terms of developing capacity and so on. And we really want to include as many of those as possible in different languages with interviews and so on, so that, if you like, what Pathways as it is at the moment becomes the structure from which all of that experience can be grouped and can be accessed. So Ross, if you move us on to the first topic, so the wider reform context. And this section is very deliberately takes a broad brush approach, because I think, you know, whenever I've talked to accountants working in the public sector in many jurisdictions around the world, the challenge we all face is actually we understand the benefits of accrual reporting compared to cash, but how do you communicate that to the policy analysts, to statisticians, to politicians, and so on? And so this opening section is very much about trying to bring those arguments right up to the top and give you, you know, the sort of broader themes, so that you can set the context for other people, and that you can actually, if you like, use that material to adjust the message to the audiences that you're working with, because being able to talk to them in a way that appeals to them and they understand and addresses the problems that they're seeing is hugely important. You know, they don't necessarily need to know all of the technicalities. They certainly will not need to know the details of the IPSAS themselves. You as professionals will do, but this is about the bigger picture communication. And so in terms of the scene setting, trying to take a step back and articulate the benefits of accrual accounting and set that within the context of a strong public financial management system, not individual areas, but how all of the areas actually fit together. And as I said, in terms of the benefits of accrual, it really does depend on integrating that with wider PFM reforms. And every jurisdiction, wherever they are, can always make improvements to their PFM system. You know, it's really a case of don't let the best be the enemy of the good, in terms of it's always worthwhile making the reforms, but this is designed to address everybody at different levels in terms of where you're at. But that emphasis on this is part of a wider system, link your reforms to wider reforms. And that was certainly something that I found was very important in selling the benefits of the reforms, was really to talk to people about how it would help them deliver what they're trying to do in terms of stronger governance and public financial management. So as I said, the top level messages, addressing different audiences, what things would concern them, because that being crucial, that you talk to them about the things that really mean something to them. This is the top level, then the resources are provided at as we progress through those different levels that I showed you before. So Ross, if you want to pass on to the next slide. So governance. You know, I know from personal experience that actually, you know, you can do a lot as an advocate. I led the whole of government accounts program in the UK Treasury for almost 8 years. So I was obviously a strong advocate of change, but I spent a lot of time actually talking to the leaders, whether they were the senior policy officials within the Treasury, the UK Ministry of Finance, whether they were senior officials, both accountants and policy people in other departments, in various different types of organisation across the UK, and of course the audit community, the supreme audit institutions, and also to Parliament. And all of that is about communicating to people. It's about getting them on side, because if you've got strong support for the change, then it will help you to deliver that. If you don't have that support, then you'll find that ultimately you won't be able to deliver the reforms, and it can be even as simple as the fact I found in publishing whole of government accounts, that actually once you started producing figures that showed big liabilities on the balance sheet, for example, for pensions and so on, that didn't sit so well with the political picture at that time, that people say, yes, great set of figures, but no, we're not going to publish them at this point in time. So, really working with people on presentations, what the numbers mean, how to interpret them, all of those things become really important. There is a big program of changes involved in the transition to accrual, and it's important to look at those as a whole. Which elements need to be delivered at which stages? How do they need to fit together? Certainly, in terms of the transition to accrual, you will need a central team whose task it is to lead the reform. This can't be done as a spare time activity by somebody at a junior level. You actually need adequate time to not only devise the reforms, to monitor implementation, but also to do the communication and the influence work that I've talked about already. And you need to think about, who are we trying to influence here? What are we trying to change? Are we trying to get the figures used for the statistical reports, for example? So you need to work with the statistical office, and they will need to change their data sources. Are you working with colleagues on the budget side within your Ministry of Finance? How are you engaging colleagues around the rest of the public sector? And so therefore, what do you need to do? How do you need to communicate with them at different points in time in order to get them to make the change? How do you monitor the changes that are required? So all of that is really important, and you need to think about that communication program to support those changes in terms of the audiences, when and how you communicate to them, how detailed should you make your communication, and very importantly, what are you trying to communicate to them? You at the centre will know most of what's going on. You don't need to communicate everything to everybody. It's what do you need to communicate to them in order to deliver that change. So all of that framework, that governance around your programme and how that interfaces with other governance frameworks within ministries of finance and more broadly within government, really important. Ross, if you can move on. One of the tools that we have included, and this provides a framework to think about changes, change targets, change programs, is a document by IFAC and CFRR called the International Framework for Good Governance in the Public Sector. And it sets out principles to think about in terms of analysing governance and change. And acting at all times in the public interest is the overarching distinguishing feature for good governance in the public sector. Thinking about what the organisation is there for, what it's trying to achieve in terms of the outcomes, and very importantly, and the emphasis has really risen over the last few years, sustainable economic, social and environmental benefits. And clearly nowadays we're linking those as much as possible to delivery of the SDGs. Working back from that, what do you need to do? very often there's a tendency to think about governance in terms of, well, what's the organization doing now? How has it always done things? Well, does it need to change? Does it need to outsource some of its activities and things like that? So it's actually working back from what is the organization trying to deliver, and then what does it need to do that in terms of skills and training throughout the organization, both at senior levels and at more junior levels within the organization. And this links very strongly to public financial management. Governance and public financial management go hand in hand. And that's really what the diagram on the right is saying. That's the whole system approach to public financial management. And the black cogs there around on the left-hand side are the top level 4 principles from the good governance framework. So Ross, if you can move us on to the next slide. And the idea is the whole system approach to PFM works at all levels of the public sector. It's also applicable at all stages of development within the jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It maps to other frameworks like PIFA in particular, but also other frameworks for improvement. The idea is all of this needs to tie together, and if you don't strengthen controls in one part of the system, then reforms won't work. So you can massively improve the budget system, but for example, if your internal control and financial reporting systems aren't working, then overall you're not going to get the improvements to PFM that you want. So it's very much about this whole system and the sum of all of the parts being the whole being greater than the sum of the individual parts within that. So those are the two top level frameworks that are presented in Pathways to help you analyze what changes do you need to make and how what are the ingredients for strong governance and public financial management. So moving on then to the next slide, and this is the point at which I'm going to pass over to Ross, because this is where we move from the bigger picture and, if you like, the theory into the practice itself. So Ross, if I can pass over to you at this stage.
Yes, thanks, Ian, and thanks for that good introduction on the wider tool itself and how it's designed. Very important to understand that the tool is meant to be interactive and digital, so you can move through it in various ways. But I would highlight the next few slides I'm going to go over are quite important. So, if you use the front end of the tool, please don't negate the back end of the tool, because if you look at these items that I'm about to walk through, there's a whole great deal of detail in these sections. It's really been developed from experience where people have hit challenges and problems. And it's really meant to help you think through how to overcome those by good planning and good management. So the first point I'd like to make on the implementation strategy is one that's already been made a number of times, is that accrual adoption does not happen in isolation. And the style of the transition is always affected by the context in which it occurs. And a key point under that Ian's already made, but I'll make again, is that political will is needed before starting to implement. It really is a key success factor at all stages, but when you move to the implementation stage, it's even more important, because if you're getting political pushback or you haven't influenced the right people in the right way to have buy-in, it's very difficult to implement change. Now, the implementation strategy chapter has a number of good resources as well that I'd flag, and some are highlighted on the side here. And I'd highlight as well that there are in other languages as well. So we do have some French and Spanish language resources in the tool, even if the main guidance itself is still only in English. And as Ian mentioned, we will be building that up over time. But the key to the chapter on implementation strategy is really that it needs to be a comprehensive implementation strategy. And if we start from the top down, the national implementation strategy and plan is very important in ensuring that the scope of the reform is well thought out. So are you covering all public sector entities? Is it one sector of the government, say central government, local government? What is the transition timeline? If it is all sectors, is it all sectors at once? Is it phased? And there's really good thinking and help within the tool on the planning the national implementation strategy. It goes all the way down to IT needs, systems development, and whatnot. But below that, it's also important to step back and think about the sectoral implementation plan and having more detailed plans below the national implementation plan that really looks at the different sectors in a comprehensive reform. So again, central government, state government, local government, state-owned enterprises, things like that, and making sure that there's a detailed plan that links up with that national plan that ensures that the implementation timelines link up appropriately, that the details are thought out so that the program change managers can achieve their goals in a way that syncs up with the main plan. And again, taking it down to the entity level, you shouldn't negate that each entity itself that's reporting will need its own plan, its own program leaders, its own change drivers to make sure that the key items from the sectoral and the national implementation plans are effectively planned out for that entity so that it can achieve the timelines. Often a great plan can fall apart with poor implementation. And when thinking about implementation, it is important to go to the various levels and make sure that all of the plans sync up, are aligned in timelines, the appropriate buy-in is there at each level. Again, because the success in the implementation will require that all entities, all sectors, and the national plan all sync up and meet at the same time. And that can be a real issue that impacts political will when you have unplanned delays or things that haven't been planned for in an appropriate way that cause delays, and it creates backlash to the reforms. Another key issue we see when planning reforms is the need for capacity building and capacity development. And again, this needs to start in the thinking at the planning stage of the reform, so well before starting the implementation, but it really relates to identifying the needs. And this is human resource needs, this is IT resource needs, it's training and development, and even how you're going to go about building that capacity. So often there are external support and capacity building departments available, either through the professional accountancy organizations, international organizations, regional organizations, and even consultants that you can identify. And this chapter is really helpful in walking through how to do these various steps and giving helpful hints and ideas based on past reforms on how you can plan around the capacity building perspective. I won't touch on the implementation point on this slide at this point because I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about sustaining the reforms. And it is important that the reforms themselves become institutionalized in the public sector of the various entities. And that means recruiting the right individuals to fill the capacity gaps from an HR perspective. It means an ongoing plan for retention of those skilled personnel that you will need going forward, including educating and ensuring knowledge transfer amongst the various professionals, again, because you will have departures, you will have changes in management, working with educational institutions such as universities to make sure that basics like public sector accounting and audit are being taught so that your new accountants and professionals coming through the pipeline have the skills need. It might be establishing public sector training institutes or centers within the public sector to, again, make sure that ongoing knowledge development is there, because you do need professional judgment and you do need public sector expertise to apply accrual standards and audit them and use the information appropriately. And one thing I did want to note here on sustaining the reforms, and an important point, is if you are working with external providers, whether it's an international organization or a consultant, if they come in and help you plan and implement your reform, ensure that plan and implementation plan has an appropriate chapter or guidance around transitioning the knowledge from the external providers to the local staff, and that's built into the plan. That can be a key area where reforms can really stall and hit a roadblock. Once the external support goes away, if the local full-time staff haven't been appropriately trained on the new systems and processes to an extent that they can perform after the external providers, consultants leave. This is something we see consistently as a challenge, but it's also something you can plan for and make sure your transition plan adequately addresses. And again, just to highlight, the tool itself has quite a number of useful resources and helpful hints that go into great detail on this. So if you're planning around this phase, please consult the tool and work through it, because it is meant to be a comprehensive tool that you work through rather than just read and leave alone. So I highly recommend doing that. Couple more quick slides that I'll touch on, and accounting standards and policies. Again, make sure this is a specific work stream in your implementation plan, and you think about some of the key decisions. So, if you're adopting IPSAS, are you adopting it indirectly or directly using the IPSAS as is? Do you have a national standard setting process that endorses IPSAS, or a national standard setting process that sets national standards based on IPSAS? Thinking about that infrastructure around the reporting framework and standards itself and how it be implemented is quite important, and your plan should address that. Another area it should address is the accounting policies themselves. Is that something you want centralized across the public sector or sectors of the public sector? If so, you might need to think about how you're going to have a team that develops accounting policies and manuals so that it gets consistently applied across the entities. Alternatively, you can take a decentralized approach where you leave it to the entities to set their own policy choices and interpret the IPSAS. There are pros and cons to both, so just make sure that if you're doing that you take the time to appropriately think about that. And there are strategic decisions to be taken. So if I'm thinking about accounting for property, plant, and equipment, there's an option in our current IPSAS to report on either historical or current value basis. And depending on the information needs and how you plan to use the accounting reporting, you might choose one over the other. And just to highlight a few more things on this chapter in particular, it's a very helpful walkthrough of the IPSAS guidance without going through the standards one by one, but by looking at topical levels on the different types of assets, revenue, and expense, and then grouping the IPSAS within those, so you can help, if you're new to IPSAS, understand where to look for guidance on different types of transactions, and then click through to the actual IPSAS. And again, very helpful specific resources, and some great ones from Pulsar in particular that we're very happy to include in the tool in this section, and I highly recommend having a look at those. And lastly, I won't spend a ton of time on this final slide, but it is useful to note that IT systems and IT infrastructure are definitely a critical success factor in a successful reform program. And it is something you should be evaluating right from your beginning in your planning, because investments in your IT infrastructure, human resource capacity, architecture, systems implementation, and interfacing will be really important. And you need to think about the information you want, how it's shared amongst entities, and how to design key IT-related items like your chart of accounts, your consolidation and reporting framework, and just how the information will be used for non-accounting purposes. So interaction with things like your statistical reporting, budgetary practices, and whatnot. So plan that from the beginning and make sure that it's adequately resourced, so you've got the resources you need to invest in that. Also, Ian's already mentioned this, but it's always recommended that public accounting reforms happen in the wider reform. And when thinking about the wider reforms, don't miss the opportunity to challenge ongoing business processes and procedures, how those can be simplified, updated to be more modern when you're updating your system and your accounting framework. There are benefits there, and it's important, but you need to plan that in, take resources and time to move that forward. So don't miss that opportunity. And also, leverage internal resources that can help you through the process and be helpful advocates in driving change. And internal audit is one area highlighted in financial reporting and information, accounting policy decisions, and testing out judgments on internal audit. I would also say that external audit and interactions with supreme audit institutions is something that should be planned for in the report across all areas and engaged with upfront. It's not an issue I would leave to the end once you're trying to do your first set of IPSAS statements when you start engaging the audit function, whether it's internal or external. With that, that closes the overview of the tool, and then just thank you. A tool that will continue to evolve and be updated with current resources and guidance as it becomes available. And thanks again.
Thank you, Ian, Rose. A very interesting presentation. Now I would like to turn the microphone over to Karen and then to Roberto, who are going to present Armenia and Brazil experience in terms of implementation of public sector accounting reforms in their countries. Karen?
Thank you, Dmitry. Dear colleagues, I'm honored to present, to participate in this very interesting event and also to present Armenia's experience of reform in public sector accounting sphere and also our efforts in development of accrual-based accounting system in public sector. So,
let me know if you would like me to share the screen.
Should I share? Or?
If you prefer, you can share directly, or I can do it for you.
Oh, please. Thank you. Actually, in Armenia, process of embedding international accounting standards started in 2009 in private sector, and the same process in public sector began much later. What was the situation like? Please, next slide. Yes, thank you. What was the situation like of what we had in public sector accounting sphere before this reform was initiated? There was no unified framework. For example, an accounting system was based on various concepts. For example, ministries or other governmental bodies maintained accounting using former Soviet Union regulations, or state non-commercial organizations prepared their accounts using private sector frameworks, IFRSs. In some cases, sectoral regulations were developed, and these sectoral regulations set accounting rules for particular certain sector, for example, for healthcare organizations. And so the objective was to introduce a unified accounting system in public sector, which would be based on international standards and comparable with internationally recognized statistical frameworks, with international public sector accounting standards, and also would be comparable with private sector accounting standard. Please, next slide, Dmitry. However, after some period of time, particularly in 2014, I think government realized the importance of accrual-based accounting system, and also the opportunities that accrual-based accounting system can provide reliable information on financial position and performance of public sector organizations. high-level management can receive operational and reliable information for the management to make informed and right decisions, and also to have financial statements on different level of government, including on the whole of government level, but which is important on the same methodological basis. So the law on accounting of public sector organizations was adopted in 2014. Please, next slide. And this was the, let's say, the start of some preparatory stage of embedding new reporting system. And during 2014 and 15, regulatory framework of new system was formed. Besides law, national standard and also chart of account, which is a really important tool for the implementation of standard, were adopted. By the way, our chart of accounts enables to collect the information not only for financial reporting purposes, but also for budgetary ones. And also other sub legislation was developed and adopted at this time. At the same time, the most a couple of points about our national standards, about IPSAS. The most important challenge was to determine the methodological basis for the reporting. It is explicit that there were not many alternatives, either fully adopt IPSAS or to develop national standard. Eventually, there were many discussions on this point, to be honest, and eventually taking into account many factors like features of the functions of public sector organizations of Armenia, and why not the complexity of implementation of full IPSAS, it was decided to develop national standard, Armenian public sector accounting standard, and so-called IPSAS. It is completely based on IPSAS. However, to some extent, for example, the options of choosing the evaluation method provided by international standards are limited to avoid differences between accounting policies when consolidating financial statements of separate public sector organizations. For example, useful life of TPs is not determined by separate public sector organizations. It is set in our legislation by order of Ministry of Finance, and authorized body, Ministry of Finance, defines these useful lives. We didn't include in payment section in our standards, and instead of this, required to measure lands and buildings using evaluation model. So there are some differences, of course, but I think on this first step, it was very important to have quite simple or relatively simple standard. In fact, but this is an interim solution, of course, having goal to fully switch to IPSAS in the future, I hope nearest future. So in fact, the actual implementation of new system can be divided into three main stages. Next slide, please. The first stage is preparation of financial statement of separate public sector organizations. The aim of this stage was create culture of financial reporting at the lowest level. The second level we can name the interim consolidation level or ministerial consolidation level. And the third level is whole of government accounts preparation level. In this level, we will finally, which is also finally goal of our reforms, to have consolidated financial statement of the government at some of time. Of course, the development of new accounting system is not without challenges, and I've grouped challenges into main two groups, as it was already mentioned by our panelists. The first group is, please, next slide. The first group is capacity of specialists, of accountants, and I think most of you will be agree that it's not an easy task to require accountant of small school prepare or keep records on accrual basis, use standards, etc. And the second group of challenges can be named consolidating issues, which includes two aspects: methodological and technical. Please, next. Here are steps taken by Minister of Finance to overcome first challenge. The Ministry of Finance, to best of its abilities, provides methodological assistance to public sector accountants and all specialists in this sphere in various formats: trainings, explanations, meetings, etc. On demand, we also organize field visits to certain public sector organizations to deliver their on-job trainings. At the same time, Minister of Finance carries out monitoring of operations and financial statement of separate public sector organizations that have already completed the transition to new system. And I'd like also to talk about one interesting initiative. It is preparation and providing to public sector organizations professional handbook. It contains information on upcoming changes in public sector accounting legislation, also information on certain errors or inaccuracies identified during monitoring, and also practical suggestions for correcting these errors. I would like also to mention the importance and essential contribution of PULSAR program in all our initiatives. For example, new qualification system was developed and introduced in Armenia in 2020, and this is also a very important tool to improve capacity of accountants and also to enhance quality of financial information. Now there's, please, next slide. There is a requirement in legislation for nearly 100 organizations that they should have qualified accountant. This is logical continuation of the processes initiated in the framework of PULSAR program. Right now, at this moment, we have 230 qualified accountants. So what regards to the second group of challenge, consolidated issues, we developed methodology for the consolidation of financial statements. Please, next slide. Regarding the technical solutions, the compressor project now is initiated by Ministry of Finance, which aims to introduce integrated financial management information system in Armenia. We of course hope that introduction of and successful finish of this project will allow us to move forward to go to do one more step in these reforms. So it is presumed that IFMIS will consist from different PFM modules like budgeting. Next slide, please. From budgeting, treasury, internal audit, accounting, reporting, and this project started this year, and it is in the map stage of business processes mapping. On the next slide are presented our expectations from accounting model of IFMIS. We hope that accounting model will allow to maintain accounting on a centralized way, automatically form consolidated financial statement on different level, on ministerial or on whole of government level, and also to form various type of reports like budget execution, statistical, etc. And in all above mentioned activities, the role of WorldBank is essential. So I would like to thank take this opportunity. Thank you to all of our colleagues for continuing support to all our initiatives. I think that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you, and if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
We're going to have the session on question and answer a little bit later after the presentation of Roberta. So I would like to invite Roberta to come forward.
Bom dia a todos, boa tarde. Obrigado,
Good morning, everyone. Good
Dmitry, por
afternoon.
parte de Pulsar,
Thank you, Dimitri,
e Juan,
on the part of
por parte do
Pulsar,
Focal,
and
do qual o
Juan
Brasil faz parte, né, que é o Fórum
Focal.
dos Contadores
Brazil is a part of
Governamentais
Focal,
da
which
América
is the
Latina. Muito obrigado pelo
Forum
convite para
of Latin
fazer a
American,
apresentação.
Inter-American
Eu sou Heriberto,
accountants.
subsecretário de
Thank you very
Contabilidade
much for the
Pública
invitation.
da Secretaria
I'm
do
a
Tesouro
subsecretary
Nacional
of Public
do Brasil.
Accounting.
Bem, eu vou compartilhar a
For the
apresentação.
Secretariat in Brazil, I'm going to share my presentation.
Vamos lá. Então, o objetivo aqui da apresentação é demonstrar, assim como o colega Karen fez, né, a nossa experiência do Brasil no processo de adoção do regime de competência, que é a adoção das International Public Sector Accounting Standards. Bem, então é praticamente demonstrar o caminho que aqui no Brasil nós adotamos para esse processo de adoção das normas internacionais de contabilidade do setor público. Eu preparei apenas um slide com os bullet points, porque como a apresentação aqui o objetivo é mais estratégico, gerencial, né, não é tão técnica, eu achei interessante eu colocar os bullet points e falar mais acerca da nossa experiência. Bem, eu destaco aqui 6 pontos-chave que permitiram o êxito do Brasil no processo de convergência, né, de adoção das IPSAS. Primeiramente, a formação de um comitê, de um grupo técnico com equipes de alto nível para a edição das normas contábeis convergidas. Então, inicialmente, por parte do Conselho Federal de Contabilidade, juntamente aqui com a Secretaria do Tesouro Nacional, essas duas instituições fizeram uma parceria para a edição das normas brasileiras de contabilidade convergidas às IPSAS. Então, por meio
converted
desse
to
processo,
IPSAS.
nós editamos
This
aqui, vocês
process
conseguem ver a minha outra tela,
has helped
que
us,
são as
if
normas
you can see
brasileiras de
my other
contabilidade
screen,
técnicas
these
do
are
setor
the
público, né? Então
Brazilian
foram editadas
technical
todas as normas brasileiras
public
do
sector
setor público que
national
têm as
standards.
respectivas
All of them
correspondências
were
com
edited,
as
and
IPSAS,
each one
ok?
has
Então
a
esse processo, né,
respective
diz respeito a,
IPSAS. Each one relates to one IPSAS.
a
So this
internalizar, né,
process has to do with
as normas
internalizing
internacionais, adaptando
international
para
standards and
o caso
adapt
brasileiro,
them
né? Verificando se há
to
alguma
the
restrição
Brazilian case.
legal. Vocês conseguem ver novamente a minha apresentação slide, sim?
If you can see my slides presentation once again.
Então,
Yes, thank you.
consiste no processo de convergência, basicamente adaptando a
So
linguagem, né,
what
e
we
verificando se
did was
existem
adapt the
eventuais restrições
language
legais
and
aqui no
seeing if
país,
there were
que
any legal
não é o
restrictions
caso,
in
na maioria
Brazil,
dos
and that was
casos.
not the case
Bom, deixa eu
in
compartilhar
most
novamente aqui
cases.
a minha apresentação. Vocês conseguem enxergar, né? A apresentação.
You can see my
Então, esse é o
presentation,
primeiro
right?
ponto-chave. Em 2008 foi
So this is
constituído um
the
primeiro
first
grupo
key.
que iniciou
In
a quebra de
2018, the
paradigma
first group
do regime de
was
caixa para o regime de
begun.
competência
It started
em
breaking
2008 e a
paradigms
partir de
from the
2016 o grupo passou a
towards
editar
the
as normas
public
convergidas, adotadas, né, com as IPSAS. Esse é o primeiro
accounting.
ponto importante.
And
Segundo ponto
then they
importante, que
started
foi
to edit and
crucial
adopt the
no nosso
edited
processo
standards.
de
The second
implementação
point, which was
das normas
crucial for
internacionais de
our
contabilidade do setor público,
implemented for
foi o
IPSAS
fato
or
da gente ter
IAS
no nosso
was the
quadro, né, da gente
fact
ter
that
por meio
we
de concurso
had,
público.
because we have
Sim.
public.
Roberto, sorry to interrupt you. Could you slow down a little bit?
Okay.
And
No problem.
can we check, Roberto, which channel you are on talking right now? Can you please check?
Perfect.
Which channel are you on? Which language channel down there?
Roberto, ¿en qué idioma, en qué canal de idioma estás ahora? Abajo.
Português.
No, please switch to floor, to the English or to floor.
Original.
No, to floor. Original. So that.
¿Podrías cambiar al original?
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Well, so I was speaking about the key issues. You can see my presentation on screen, right? Well, so first of all, I spoke about formation a committee, which helped us edit the adopted standards as they related to international standards. This was a key issue in the first step towards adopted standards. And nowadays, all of the international standards have been adapted to Brazil. The second key issue has to do with having qualified professionals in our institutions. They are qualified at IPSAS, International Accounting Standards, or IRS. We have professionals, some with master's degrees, some with doctorates, who know the international the IAS. And so this really helped our implementation of international laws, because these professionals were already aware of how to apply the standards in public entities. This was the second key issue. The third issue was, besides editing the adopted standards, the IPSAS standards, we adopted a process which we called manualization. It was quite intense. There are several cases which are more important than others. So through identifying the most important or relevant cases, there is a chain of discussions through a technical charter of the public sector who work with accounting, and we discuss in this chamber the issues which need a more detailed analysis. And based on that, we edit the applicable manual of accounting as it applies to the public sector. I don't have, it's not open here on my screen, but editing and manualization of these accounting procedures was very important. Back to the presentation. Besides creating the manuals of these accounting procedures according to the events and according to standardized financial statements, we also edited a plan of accounts for all federal, national. So this process of adopting an integralized plan of accounts for Brazil really helped us along because it gave our language a common denominator. All of the institutions use the same terms and use standardized accounting routes for the same phenomena and the same events. And of course, for example, demonstrations of cash flows and other types of financial statement structures and charts of accounts were standardized in these manuals. So in other words, turning accounting procedures into manuals with charts of accounts and standardized financial statement structures was very important to apply the international standards. The fourth issue has to do with the operational technical issues. We have a Brazilian system which is called CFRR, Integrated Accounting and Financial Online System. But to start with, as in most countries, CFRR originally had a vocation which had to do with budget and financial. So in technology, IT, which would be the best strategy to adopt to change CFRR, a whole system, we decided to integrate CFRR with the corporate asset management systems. For in case of federal income, the systems which manage these systems in terms of the new accounting system, we decided to integrate CFRR with this specific corporate asset management system. And in these rules which had to do with accounting. So in terms of measurement, recognitions, they were placed in these corporate asset management systems. Therefore, we integrated them and reflected them into CFRR, which puts CFRR in a position to capture the activities which have an impact on federal levels. So the systems that manage public debt, public assets, public liabilities, fiscal risks, We have several corporate systems which have to do with managing our assets and liabilities. No, what we did was the opposite. We used the systems that were in place that managed the assets and the liabilities. We integrated them into CF, and so CF would be able to reflect them. This was very important in this convergence process in Brazil. Another important issue is, beside the government, the federal government, we have a very interested approach in subnational, and must be able to adopt these levels. So we have developed a system for collecting and analyzing accounting data from these subnational entities. So states and municipalities must send their accounting documents and fiscal reports on a monthly basis to the Federation, so we can consolidate the state level and municipal level accounts. This helps us analyze the data, which also helps us promote the process of convergence in the states and municipalities in themselves. So we have adopted, for example, a ranking. For example, a ranking of the accounting information in states and municipalities. This, as you can see on my screen, is our ranking. Information quality. We analyze the state that is sent by these states and municipalities. We run checks, we run analysis, and we classify them. This process has helped us really leverage the convergence between states and municipalities, because it encourages a certain level of competition between states and municipalities, because each state and municipality wants to be in a better ranking in terms of quality of accounting information according to the international standards for the public sector. So this was an important issue to leverage the convergence of states and municipalities. But last but not least, the process of adoption and application of international financial auditing standards by supervisory institutions. So Brazil, in parallel to what they were doing, besides the accountings, we are in the process of adopting international financial auditing standards as well. In terms of the Union's Accounts Tribunal, there is an in-depth look at financial statements from the Brazilian federal government. For example, in 2022, we have already had 15 inquiries. We have a group of 70 auditors who are highly qualified in international financial auditing standards and international standards as a whole. And according to what they detect, to what they find, things are reported as, their findings are reported as recommendations, which have immense effect for public managers to implement their recommendations, which really helps us improve financial statements to a higher degree. So the process of detection of any distortion that might happen according by financial auditing, this creates recommendations, and the managers are obliged they are mandated to institute these recommendations. This is so important in Brazil that the president of the republic is annually charged with showing a financial statement. It is made by two different opinions. The first opinion has to do, it is a report on accounting reports, and the second report has to do with compliance with national standards. So you can see the importance of very clear importance of this conformity. We went through an impeachment process a few years ago. It wasn't due to accounting, it was due to another issue, because in case there is a negative opinion on accounting reports, this may lead to an impeachment of the president of the republic. So both accounts are very important to make sure that the government accounts are as compliant as possible. So basically, I have walked you through the 6 key issues which have permitted the Brazilian compliance road, and I am at your disposal for any questions. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Roberto. Yeah, just in time for the question and answer session, and we have several questions that are being sent by the chat and the QA part of the tool. So I will pass the microphone to Juan Carlos to handle that session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. I hope you can hear me well. And first of all, congratulations to all our speakers. The presentations have been great. And we have received also a number of questions. Some of them are directly addressed to Karen, others, another one we have for Heriberto. And we also have a question for Ian. So maybe we can start actually with the question for Ian, and then we can go to the questions for our country panelists. So, well, essentially the question by Natalia Rosakevich, well, Ian told about the necessity of underlying the importance of public sector accounting reforms for all stakeholders. Could you please give some recommendations how to convince an ordinary accountant of a school, a hospital, etc., of the public sector accounting reform importance? Thanks in advance. Actually, a great question. Ian, if you could please help us to respond.
Thank you. So I think it's important really to think about what would make a difference for that individual. And I think, you know, if you talked to somebody at that level, they would undoubtedly see there were a number of challenges they had in terms of day-to-day, in terms of getting people to apply the right processes and so on. And I think, you know, obviously in the bigger picture, you have the top level reforms in mind, but by bringing those down to the individual school level, they ought to see advantages for themselves in terms of addressing problems that they're seeing day to day, but also in terms of how they deal with their stakeholders. So I think the whole thing is about actually, yes, have the bigger picture, but bring it right back down to what will improve financial management in a school, in a hospital, or so on, because my experience is that the bigger, what you're trying to do, the bigger picture will always have benefits at the lower level. It's just actually thinking those through and then making sure that the individual at that level has the tools in order to be able to convince their colleagues to make the changes. So, you know, it's about helping them think through, well, how would I persuade the head teacher or colleagues to be better at using their budgets or you know, being accountable for their assets. So whatever the issue actually is. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Ian. So as I mentioned, we have a number of questions for Karen. And well, but if anyone also wants to complement, please feel free to do that. So we have 4 questions. So I will start with the first so that we can go one by one. So the first question is, what type of information for internal audit is obtained from the IFMIS, the Integrated Financial Management Information System? And Karen, if you could please help us to address this question.
Okay, thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you for excellent question. And as I have mentioned, we just started this project this year, a couple of months ago, and now we are in the process of mapping of business processes. But I think all information which would be included in IFMIS is planned to be used by internal auditors for implementation of their tasks, and also I think some audit procedures can be implemented in automatic way after complete introduction of IFMIS in our system. We expect that this process will be end by 2024.
Thank you, Karen. Actually, the second question relates also to the IFMIS, and what is the public sector coverage of the system and the timeline for complete rollout, which I think you already mentioned something.
Thank you. The coverage of public sector is defined in our law on accounting on public sector organizations. So all ministries and governmental bodies, and also communities and organizations created by these bodies are formulate a public sector in Armenia. But state-owned entities are not included in public sector. So I can say that ministries, governmental bodies, communities, and organizations created by them. And as I have mentioned, it is planned to roll out IFMIS by the end of 2024.
Excellent. Well, the third question is, how did you resolve the problem of pending accrued balances, which were not reliable before you started the implementation of IPSAS?
Yes, thank you. Very good question, and very difficult question, by the way. What we had done, we put a requirement for all public sector organizations to reevaluate all their assets and liabilities before transition, and entry balance has been prepared and inputted in the accounting software. The main way is that.
Thank you, Karen. We have a fourth question. This comes from Natalia, and the question is, well, it was mentioned that during the centralized accounting maintenance is functioning in Armenia. Could you clarify what it was meant by this maintenance? Is it IT system or training program or anything else? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. But centralized accounting is our expectation that we will have after introduction of IFMIS in Armenia. Now, the accounting in public sector for Armenia is maintained by decentralized way, but we hope that after introduction of IFMIS, we will have a chance to centralize this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Karen, very clear. We have another question for Heriberto. This comes from Maria Teresa Agüero from Paraguay. And the question is whether it exists an analytical system, property, plant, and equipment, and how did you go about the measurement of the value of these assets? Heriberto, please.
Thank you, Maria Teresa, for your question. We have basically two systems that generate varieties, plants, and equipment. One is a system of mobile assets and immobile assets. Mobile assets, we try to adopt market value mensuration method. So they are reevaluated periodically. What we expect them to be is to be reassessed on an annual basis. However, there are operational challenges to do that because the national territory owns many immobile assets. So we sometimes are not able to do that on a yearly basis, but we do that on the basis of market value. That we also have, let's say we have plots of land which are meant to be used for agrarian reform. Union-owned land destined for this situation, and in this case the market value is not what is used, but there is a centralized system for our immobile assets and another system for measuring our mobile assets, and CF integrates both systems. And through integration, the data is sent to CF. They are accounted for and they are integrated in the union report.
Thanks a lot, Heriberto. And I think we covered all of the questions that we have so far. We have a couple of minutes remaining, but Dimitri, don't know if you want to continue or maybe if someone else have a quick question, we could address it.
Yeah, Dmitry, we don't hear your English on English channel. We don't hear you. There is no translation. You are speaking Spanish, or?
I can hear English.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I was talking on the original sound. Yes. Thank you, Juan Carlos, for taking care of the question and answer. To ask Carmen to proceed with the closing remarks of the event.
Thank you, Dmitry. That was very interesting discussion based to accrual accounting based on IFAC paper jointly with IPSAS Board and which countries to start from different baseline. That is what is also very important. IFAC advocacy for and accountability is very much welcomed by the WorldBank and our Pulsar program. And this is key for stronger governance, PFM system, and high quality information. The pathways to accrual, it covers a few elements on governance. We talked about the leadership, the core team, and communication as key elements. Here on the role of accountancy profession in public sector reform remains critical and was re-emphasized. This is very important. Also, IFAC produces a number of very important papers, which was also reintroduced, including this public index, which again remind us of a major move of countries globally towards accrual. So from current 30%, in 3 years' time, the expectations is to have 50% accrual, and by 2030, 83% of accrual, with significant part of partial accrual, countries using partial accrual moving to the full accrual. It means that the transition of global transition is on the right track, and countries will need just to speed up and pick up the reform. There are another aspects which is also very important discussed today. It's including the internal controls, internal audit, and external audit. It was discussed it was shared by IFAC and IPSAS Board, as well as from our country-specific experiences, which reconfirms that in practice we need to look broader. And C+ the whole of government approach also helps just to look into the broader picture, just to succeed with reforms. Also, the IFAC IPSAS this training of trainer knowledge products is very much a useful document, and I think the knowledge product and is used by Pulsar countries. So now we have, thanks to IFAC and IPSAS Board, we have IPSAS Study 14. Modern tool, web-based tool, and it has very good coverage as presented today. Governance, PFM frameworks, again coming from the whole of system approach, implementation strategy, which forces again the political leadership importance and consistency between national and sectoral plans, building transition of knowledge from the international experts to the local who help to implement and to sustain the reform, as well as accounting standards and policies, including decentralized for policy choices and entity level policies. Again, there was a lot of discussion today on the IT infrastructure systems which require heavy investments, but more and more about chart of accounts, how to have an integrated, harmonized chart of accounts to manage different purposes, budgeting, statistical, financial reporting, management, costing, which was discussed today. And again, not just simply copy paste, but try to review the business processes, do business process reengineering with purpose of simplification. And so they are meeting the needs of the countries. From Armenia and Brazil, it was very interesting to hear how the targets they are trying to achieve. It's reliable financial position and performance of the government, and also for improved quality information for better decisions. On Brazil, it was interesting to hear how the formation of the team or committees was put in place, how they engaged supreme audit institution, including ranking of quality of accounting of states and municipalities to boost competition. Interesting from Brazilian experience. In Armenia, we also heard approach and legislation being a key element in this process. Again, focus was made on the chart. In case of Armenia, it was very made clear that they started with IPSAS, Armenian Public Sector Accounting Standards, which simplified and with limited alternatives provided at the initial stage, with the plan for a broader implementation. As we can see, the challenges remain to be skills and capacity and consolidation. On consolidation, it means also not methodology on one side and technical IFMIS, IT and integration with budget execution, debt management. So these are the questions which were raised and challenges which I trust Pulsar also addresses those. And I would also like very much the point made by Ian that don't make the best to be enemy of the good. So let's try just to move forward with the reforms. We are on the right track. And using this opportunity, I would like just to thank all the speakers for very useful event, and on both on the Pulsar and Focal networks, that for very interactive event and quite useful for our countries to make reform progress. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you, Arman. As you may know, the World Bank fiscal year is coming to an end, which is on June 30th. It means that all of us are trying to do everything we have not done during the rest of the year. So we are planning to organize one more event for this year, which will be on presentation of main findings of the book on public sector accounting reform status. This is a very nice and relevant publication, and we hope you all will be able to join us. Thank you for joining us. Please stay safe and have a great rest of the day.